In March 2012, in Madison County, Iowa, 20-year-old Clara Whitmore stood beside a rusted gate as county trucks rolled onto the 80 acres her late grandfather had spent 40 years protecting. One after another, the dump beds lifted. White crystals crashed onto the frozen field until 18 tons of road salt formed a hill taller than the hood of her old Ford 8N tractor. The highway supervisor signed a clipboard, shrugged, and drove away while neighbors gathered along the fence. Someone laughed. Someone else said the farm was finished. Clara looked at the mountain of salt without saying a word. She couldn't afford lawyers. She couldn't afford to move it. And before sunset, she noticed something that made even less sense. The pile wasn't supposed to be there. The county's snow storage yard had reached capacity after one of the harshest Iowa winters in decades. According to a temporary emergency order, excess road salt had been delivered to unused agricultural property scheduled for later removal. Somewhere between paperwork and reality, Clara's pasture had become that property. The mistake was obvious. Correcting it wasn't. The county promised it would all be removed within 3 weeks. 3 weeks became 6. Then 8. Every phone call ended with another apology and another promise. Meanwhile, spring was arriving. Clara had inherited the farm only 4 months earlier, along with overdue property taxes, an aging barn, 2 broken grain bins, and equipment that most neighbors believed belonged in a museum. Her grandfather hadn't left savings. He had left land, debt, and a handwritten notebook with weather records stretching back to 1978. She read it every evening. Not because she enjoyed old numbers. Because she kept finding observations no weather report ever mentioned. Southfield stays damp 5 days longer. The ash trees know before the clouds. Never ignore where water remembers. Most people would have called them riddles. Her grandfather had simply called them notes. By April, snowmelt reached the enormous salt pile. Thin streams of white water began running downhill across the pasture. Neighbors stopped their pickups along the gravel road just to watch. "Well," one man laughed, "least you won't have weeds." Another pointed toward the field. "You planning to grow pretzels?" The joke spread faster than the runoff. At the feed store, conversations stopped whenever Clara walked inside. Nobody said much to her directly. They didn't have to. Everyone knew salt ruined farmland. Everyone knew crops couldn't survive it. Everyone knew the county had destroyed her future. Everyone except Clara. She never argued. She simply drove home, started the old Ford 8N, and continued repairing fences one post at a time. The tractor had belonged to her grandfather since 1951. The faded red paint was chipped nearly everywhere, but the engine still started with a slow, familiar rhythm after a careful pull on the choke. Most afternoons ended the same way. Fence. Barn. Notebook. Salt pile. Then sleep. One evening she noticed birds gathering near the runoff channels. Not drinking. Watching. As if waiting. She crouched beside one shallow stream and touched the soil. The ground felt strangely firm. Not dead. Just different. She filled an old coffee can with muddy water and carried it back to the barn. The next morning, she compared it with water from another pasture. The difference wasn't obvious. Until she let both jars settle. One remained cloudy. The other separated into distinct layers much faster. She wasn't sure why. But she wrote it down. 3 days later, an elderly pickup rattled into her driveway. The driver climbed out slowly. Earl Jensen. Retired soil conservation technician. 78 years old. Known across 3 counties for speaking only when absolutely necessary. He studied the salt pile for nearly 5 minutes before saying anything. Your grandfather would have measured the runoff. Then he walked back toward his truck. Clara stopped him. Measured what? He looked across the pasture. Not the salt. The water. That was all. He drove away before she could ask another question. Most people would have dismissed the visit. Clara didn't. The next morning she drove into town and bought the cheapest measuring stakes she could find. She placed them every 20 yards across the lower pasture where runoff traveled after rain. Every storm. Every puddle. Every inch. She recorded everything. By May, county officials finally returned. Highway Supervisor Richard Collins stepped from his truck wearing polished boots that had never touched fresh soil. He stared at the shrinking salt mound. "We'll haul it next week." "You said that 6 weeks ago," Clara answered quietly. "We're doing our best." He glanced across the pasture and noticed the measuring stakes. "What exactly are you doing?" "Watching." He smiled politely. "You don't need to watch. You need new topsoil." His crew laughed. One worker muttered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Girl thinks she's doing science." The trucks left without removing a single shovel of salt. That evening Clara opened her grandfather's notebook again. Between weather notes she found one folded page tucked near the back. Only one sentence. "Water always chooses the oldest road." She read it 5 times. Then carried the notebook outside. The runoff wasn't flowing where modern drainage maps said it should. It followed gentle curves almost invisible beneath the grass. Curves that matched old fence lines no longer standing. Why? She searched county archives at the tiny courthouse library. An aging plat map from 1911 showed something surprising. A shallow seasonal creek had crossed her property more than a century earlier. It disappeared from maps after drainage improvements during the 1950s. Officially, the creek no longer existed. Unofficially, water still seemed to remember. She spent the next week walking every foot of the old path. Wild rye grew thicker there. The grass stayed greener, even after warm afternoons. She pushed a steel rod into the ground every 10 feet. Sometimes it stopped after 6 inches. Sometimes it sank almost 3 feet with almost no effort. Underground wasn't uniform. Something was different beneath the surface. She just didn't know what. June arrived hotter than anyone expected. Rain became scarce. Creeks shrank. Farm ponds dropped several inches. Corn leaves across Madison County began curling during the afternoon heat. Local farmers started watching the sky instead of their fields. Weather forecasts mentioned an expanding high-pressure system settling over the Midwest. Nobody sounded worried. Not yet. At the diner, older farmers remembered dry summers. "This one won't last." "They never do." But Earl Jensen wasn't smiling. He found Clara repairing an old irrigation pump behind the barn. Without greeting her, he unfolded a newspaper. Across the front page was one headline: "Driest Spring Since 1988." He tapped the paper once, then looked toward the salt pile. "Your problem," he said quietly, "might become everybody else's." Before Clara could ask what he meant, she heard a sound coming from beneath the white hill that no one else seemed to notice. In the days that followed, Clara returned to the salt pile every morning before sunrise. The sound came only when everything else was quiet. Not a crack. Not a rumble. A faint, steady trickle, like water slipping through a narrow wooden pipe. She pressed her ear against the damp ground at the base of the mound. There it was again. Water. Moving underground. That should have been impossible. The upper pasture had no spring. Every county drainage map showed solid clay beneath the field. Even Earl Jensen had said so years earlier during a conservation meeting. Yet something beneath 18 tons of salt was carrying water. She marked the exact spot with a weathered cedar stake. By afternoon she returned carrying a narrow soil probe borrowed from the local conservation office. At 18 inches, the probe struck dense clay. At 24, it suddenly dropped another foot with almost no resistance. She withdrew it carefully. The tip emerged coated with coarse sand instead of clay. She frowned. Sand didn't belong there. Not according to any survey she'd ever seen. She wrote one sentence in her notebook. "Something old is still buried beneath this farm." A week later the first serious heat wave settled across central Iowa. By noon the air shimmered above every gravel road. The National Weather Service warned that rainfall had fallen well below normal since early April. Farmers who had planted corn early watched the leaves roll tightly by mid-afternoon, a natural defense against losing moisture. Clara drove her Ford 8N slowly through neighboring fields delivering square bales she had sold months earlier. Everywhere she looked, the same picture greeted her. Dust. Brown ditches. Shallow ponds shrinking another inch each day. Even the frogs had become strangely quiet. People who had laughed at her salt mountain had stopped joking. Now they talked about rain. Nothing else. 3 days later Richard Collins finally arrived with 2 county dump trucks and an excavator. "We're here to remove the rest," he announced. Clara nodded. "Good." The excavator scooped into the hardened mound. On the 3rd bucket, the operator suddenly stopped. The machine lurched. Its bucket had struck something solid. Not rock. Metal. The operator climbed down. "So much for easy." Richard frowned. "There shouldn't be anything under here." They dug carefully around the obstruction. Little by little rusted iron appeared. Then heavy timber. Then curved stonework. Nobody spoke. By sunset, half a circular structure had emerged from beneath decades of soil. It looked like part of an enormous underground chamber. Richard removed his hard hat. "What in the world?" Earl Jensen, who had quietly driven over after hearing the machinery, answered without excitement. "I was wondering when somebody would find it." Everyone turned. "You knew?" Richard asked. Earl shrugged. "I suspected." "Suspected what?" "Old Springhouse." Silence spread across the field. More excavation revealed a limestone vault nearly 12 feet across. An iron pipe extended downhill toward the old creek bed shown on Clara's century-old map. Inside, cool water flowed steadily through a stone channel. Not much, but enough. The Springhouse had likely been built before modern drainage systems replaced natural water collection. When newer tile drains were installed during the 1950s, everyone assumed the spring had dried up. It hadn't. People had simply forgotten where it was. The salt pile hadn't created the water. Its weight had compressed the soft surface soil enough to reveal where underground seepage naturally escaped. Richard stared at Clara. "You've been following this runoff." She nodded. "I think it's following the spring." He looked embarrassed for the first time. That evening Earl finally explained. "Water underground doesn't move like rivers." He knelt beside the Springhouse. "It travels through tiny spaces between sand, gravel, and fractured rock. Clay slows it. Sand carries it." Old farmers learned to recognize where water wanted to rise long before satellites or computers. He scooped a handful of damp sand. "This spring survived because somebody protected it over 100 years ago." He glanced toward Clara. "Your grandfather kept looking after the land. He just never found the entrance." The explanation lasted only a minute. But Clara suddenly understood why her grandfather's notebook always spoke about where water remembered. He wasn't writing poetry. He was recording patterns. The county immediately ordered work to stop until historians could inspect the structure. The salt remained. The drought worsened. By July, every weather report carried the same words. Exceptional dryness. Pastures turned pale. Creeks disappeared beneath cracked mud. Neighbors began hauling water to cattle. Several abandoned second-cut hay entirely. At the weekly farm auction, nobody wanted irrigation equipment anymore. Everyone wanted pumps. Prices doubled in less than 2 weeks. Clara had one old irrigation pump. It sat behind her barn, covered beneath a faded canvas tarp. The same one she had started repairing when Earl first visited. She spent 2 long evenings replacing cracked seals and rusted fittings. The engine coughed, backfired, then finally settled into a slow, steady rhythm. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Richard Collins returned unexpectedly one morning. Without reporters. Without county trucks. Just himself. "I owe you an apology." Clara looked up from tightening a pipe fitting. "You were right to keep watching." "I wasn't watching the salt." "I know." He hesitated. The county's emergency board approved compensation. "How much?" "Not enough." She laughed softly. At least he was honest. Then Richard noticed her irrigation lines stretching toward the rediscovered Springhouse. "You think that'll work?" "I don't know. But I know where the water wants to go." He nodded slowly. It was the first conversation they had ever finished without either defending themselves. For nearly 2 weeks the spring produced only a modest flow. Enough to fill storage tanks. Enough to water young vegetable plots. Not enough to save 80 acres. Clara refused to panic. Every evening she measured flow. Every morning she measured again. The numbers kept increasing. Only slightly, but consistently. Something underground was changing. She couldn't explain it. Neither could Earl. Then another mystery appeared. Wildlife began gathering around the spring. First came deer. Then raccoons. Then dozens of swallows. One dawn Clara counted nearly 40 barn swallows circling above the pasture. By afternoon monarch butterflies covered damp patches beside the spring. Even honeybees from neighboring apiaries traveled farther each day to reach the cool water. Animals seemed to know something long before people did. She remembered another sentence from her grandfather. Watch what arrives before asking what changed. Late one evening she spread county survey maps across her kitchen table beside the old 1911 plat map. She traced the forgotten creek. Then modern drainage tiles. Then elevation lines. Suddenly everything aligned. The abandoned creek crossed not only her farm. It crossed 4 neighboring farms before joining the Middle River. If the old underground channel was still functioning, the drought wasn't threatening only her fields. It was threatening everyone connected to that hidden water. The next morning she climbed the hill above the springhouse carrying binoculars. Across the horizon she saw something that made her lower them immediately. Every neighboring cornfield was turning gray-green under the relentless July sun, except for one narrow winding strip that followed the exact path of the forgotten creek. And someone else had just noticed it. Clara followed the winding green strip on foot before sunrise, carrying only her grandfather's notebook, a shovel, and a canteen. The air already felt warm, even though the sun had barely cleared the cottonwoods along the Middle River. Dust rose beneath every step. By mid-July 2012, Madison County, Iowa had received so little rain that the ground cracked open like old pottery. Yet the ribbon of grass above the forgotten creek remained green. Not lush. Not perfect. Just alive. She knelt every 50 yards and pressed her fingers into the soil. Outside the ribbon, the dirt crumbled into dry powder. Inside it, the earth still held moisture nearly 6 inches below the surface. The difference was impossible to ignore. But one question refused to leave her mind. If the underground water reached this far, why had nobody noticed it for decades? That afternoon she visited the county recorder's office again. The oldest employee, Margaret Ellis, disappeared into a basement packed with rolled survey maps and faded engineering plans. Nearly an hour later she returned carrying a leather tube tied with cracked twine. "I've never seen anyone ask for these." Inside lay blueprints dated 1937. Not for roads. For a federal soil conservation project. The plans showed stone diversion channels, shallow infiltration basins, and a protected underground spring system built during the Dust Bowl years by local farmers working alongside conservation crews. Most of the project had vanished after larger drainage systems were installed following World War II. One handwritten note caught Clara's attention. Never seal the upper recharge meadow. Recharge meadow. She had never heard the term before. Margaret shrugged. Neither have I. That evening Earl Jensen unfolded the fragile blueprint across the hood of Clara's Ford 8N. He traced the faded lines with a trembling finger. During the Dust Bowl, farmers learned something important. He pointed toward the hills west of the farm. When rain falls too fast, most of it runs away. But if you slow it, even for a few hours, the water sinks into the ground instead of racing downstream. He tapped the words recharge meadow. Think of the earth like a sponge. A healthy meadow lets water soak deep underground, where it can feed springs for months, sometimes years. He looked toward the salt pile. The spring isn't surviving because of this drought. It's surviving because somebody protected it decades before this drought ever arrived. Clara looked across the dry pasture. Nature hadn't created a miracle. People had once understood how to work with it. Somewhere along the way, everyone forgot. Word spread faster than Clara expected. Within days, reporters arrived. Then university researchers. Then county officials from neighboring districts. Everyone wanted to see the rediscovered springhouse. Hardly anyone asked about the farmer who had found it. Richard Collins noticed. "You all right?" She shrugged. They're interested in the spring. They should be interested in both. She smiled politely but said nothing. Her grandfather had never cared who received credit. Neither did she. The drought tightened its grip. August opened with temperatures above 100 degrees. Corn curled before noon. Soybeans dropped blossoms early. Pastures across southern Iowa turned the color of old straw. Livestock auctions became crowded as ranchers sold cattle they could no longer feed. One evening Clara stood beside the springhouse measuring water flow again. For the first time, the level had stopped rising. Her notebook remained open for several seconds before she wrote the number. Then another. Then another. Every reading matched. The increase was over. This was all the spring could produce. It wasn't enough. Not for every farm depending on the hidden underground channel. She stared into the clear water until sunset. Then quietly closed the notebook. The following morning Richard arrived with news nobody wanted. The county declared a drought emergency. Mandatory water restrictions. Emergency wells. Livestock assistance. No significant rain forecast. He hesitated. The governor's office is sending inspectors. Clara nodded. They'll want to see the spring. They'll want to pump it. She looked up sharply. What? They're discussing temporary high-capacity pumps. Her stomach tightened. A high-capacity pump could empty weeks of stored groundwater in days. The spring would appear generous. Right before it failed. That afternoon 3 engineers walked the property carrying laser levels and flow meters. One unfolded a proposal. If we install industrial pumps here, we can supply thousands of gallons every hour. Earl listened quietly. Then asked one question. For how long? The engineers exchanged glances. No way to know. Earl nodded once. Exactly. Silence settled over the group. Finally Clara spoke. The spring isn't a reservoir. It's a savings account. If you spend 50 years of water in 1 month, what happens next summer? Nobody answered. Because everyone already knew. That night she barely slept. Around midnight she stepped outside. The stars were unusually bright without clouds. Coyotes called somewhere beyond the hayfield. She walked toward the old salt pile, now less than half its original size. Moonlight reflected across the remaining white crystals. Something caught her eye. Tiny streams of moisture were still forming beneath the pile, even after months without rain. She crouched. The soil wasn't wet because of the salt. It was cool. Far cooler than the surrounding ground. She dug carefully with a trowel. 6 inches down the earth remained damp. 12 inches down. It became almost muddy. The remaining salt had shaded the ground for months, reducing evaporation while marking every place underground water naturally escaped. It had accidentally become a map. Not the solution. A map leading to the solution. She suddenly understood exactly where the recharge meadow had once begun. Before sunrise, Clara borrowed a no-till seed drill from a neighboring farmer who had little hope left for his own fields. Instead of planting crops, she sowed a carefully selected mixture of deep-rooted native prairie grasses, switchgrass, and big bluestem along the forgotten recharge corridor shown on the 1937 blueprint. Several neighbors watched from the fence. One whispered, "She's planting grass during a drought." Another shook his head. "Poor girl's given up." Richard heard them. This time, he didn't laugh. 2 days later the governor's inspection team returned. Television cameras followed. So did nearly every farmer within 20 miles. Clara stood quietly beside the springhouse while officials debated pumps, pipelines, emergency extraction, and engineering reports. Then Earl unfolded the faded 1937 blueprint one final time. Without raising his voice, he handed it to the lead hydrologist. The scientist studied it for nearly 5 minutes, then walked slowly toward the newly planted recharge strip. He knelt, scooped a handful of soil, closed his eyes. When he stood again, he looked directly at the county officials. "We've all been asking the wrong question." Everyone fell silent. He pointed toward Clara. "The question isn't how much water this spring can give us." He paused. It's how she figured out how to keep it alive. And every camera in the field turned away from the spring and toward the young farmer standing beside the last of the 18 tons of salt. The cameras stayed fixed on Clara, but she looked past them. Her eyes followed the winding strip of newly planted prairie grasses stretching across the hills, tracing the forgotten recharge meadow that had once protected the spring. The drought had burned almost every pasture in sight into shades of tan and gray. Yet beneath that narrow corridor, something invisible was still happening. Water was moving. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Patiently. Just as it had for generations. The lead hydrologist folded the brittle 1937 blueprint with surprising care. We're not installing the high-capacity pumps. Several county officials exchanged uneasy glances. The emergency board won't like that. They won't like a dry spring next year, even less. He pointed toward the recharge meadow. If we overpump this aquifer, we'll solve 1 week's problem by creating 10 years of them. For the first time since the crisis began, the conversation shifted. People stopped asking how much water could be taken. They started asking how the land could keep making it. Within days, volunteers began arriving. Not because the county ordered them. Because neighboring farmers had run out of options. Men who had once laughed at Clara's salt-covered pasture brought tractors. Families arrived carrying shovels. Teenagers hauled bundles of native prairie seed. Retired farmers walked the old creek with survey flags, comparing the forgotten 1937 plans against the landscape they had known since childhood. Someone found stone channels buried beneath weeds. Another uncovered a collapsed infiltration basin. An elderly woman pointed to an abandoned fence line. My father always said that corners stayed green for a reason. One memory led to another. One discovery uncovered the next. The forgotten system slowly returned to life. Richard Collins worked beside Clara almost every afternoon. The polished boots were gone. Now they were stained with mud. Late one evening, while rebuilding a century-old stone diversion, he finally said what had been weighing on him. I kept thinking the salt was the disaster. He looked across the valley. It never occurred to me that it forced everyone to notice something we'd ignored for 50 years. Clara rested another limestone block into place. The salt wasn't good. No. But it made us look. Richard nodded. And we should have been looking all along. By early September, a weak cold front finally crossed Iowa. It brought only a little rain. Less than half an inch. Under ordinary circumstances, nobody would have celebrated it. This time they did. But something remarkable happened. The rain disappeared almost immediately from the restored recharge meadow. Not because it ran away. Because it soaked downward. The deep-rooted prairie grasses opened pathways through the soil. The restored infiltration basins slowed the water just long enough for the ground to drink it. Instead of rushing into roadside ditches, thousands of gallons quietly slipped underground, feeding the same hidden sands that had sustained the old spring for generations. Nature wasn't working harder. People had simply stopped working against it. 3 weeks later, the visual proof arrived. The drought still gripped Madison County. Satellite images showed brown fields stretching for miles. But one ribbon cut through the landscape like a brushstroke of emerald. The Forgotten Creek Corridor. From the air, it curved across Clara's farm and into neighboring properties exactly as the old plat map had shown more than a century earlier. Television helicopters circled overhead. Photographs spread across newspapers throughout the Midwest. The image stunned people. The county had dumped 18 tons of salt on Clara's farm. Then the worst drought in 50 years hit. Yet the greenest land in the valley followed the path that the salt had helped reveal. It was the image no one forgot. People later assumed the salt had somehow improved the soil. It hadn't. Salt damages farmland. Clara corrected that misunderstanding every time someone asked. The salt wasn't the answer. It was the clue. It exposed subtle runoff patterns. It highlighted forgotten drainage routes. Most importantly, it forced everyone to investigate what lay beneath the surface instead of accepting what appeared above it. Sometimes disasters reveal mistakes. Sometimes they reveal forgotten wisdom. Autumn finally arrived. Corn yields across much of the county were painfully low. Some farms barely harvested enough to cover fuel costs. Clara's harvest wasn't extraordinary. No miracle crop appeared. But her vegetable fields survived. Her orchard kept producing. Her livestock never ran out of water. Most importantly, the spring flowed steadily into October. The county compensated her for the damage caused by the illegal salt dumping. Instead of expanding her farm, Clara invested nearly every dollar into restoring more recharge areas, rebuilding old stone waterways, and helping neighbors map forgotten springs hidden beneath their own properties. She wasn't trying to own more land. She wanted healthier land. There was a difference. One afternoon Earl Jensen stopped by carrying Clara's grandfather's weather notebook. "I think this belongs somewhere else now." She frowned. "It was Grandpa's." "It still is." He handed it back. "But someday, it'll be yours to leave behind." Inside the back cover, Earl had tucked a single handwritten page. Only one sentence. "The land remembers every kindness longer than every mistake." Clara never asked when he had written it. She already knew. 5 years later, university students studying watershed restoration visited Madison County every summer. Instead of beginning in classrooms, professors brought them to Clara's farm. They stood beside the restored springhouse while she explained infiltration, prairie roots, groundwater recharge, and forgotten conservation practices developed during the Dust Bowl. She never mentioned herself first. She mentioned the farmers who came before. The people who understood that healthy soil stored tomorrow's rain long before tomorrow arrived. Researchers eventually mapped dozens of similar forgotten recharge systems across Iowa. Several counties restored them. Others created new ones based on the same principles. What began as one county's costly mistake quietly changed how many communities thought about drought preparedness. 10 years later, Richard Collins retired from the county highway department. On his final day, he drove to Clara's farm. They walked together to the place where the mountain of salt had once stood. Nothing remained except healthy grass. "I almost ruined this place." Clara shook her head. "No. You helped uncover it." He smiled. "I still can't believe you forgave me." She looked across the fields. "My grandfather used to say land spends its whole life forgiving people. Seems like we should learn from it." Neither spoke again for a while. The wind carried the scent of late summer prairie flowers across the valley. A generation later, children visiting the farm no longer knew the story as the salt disaster. They knew it as the hidden spring. The restored meadow had become home to monarch butterflies, meadowlarks, native bees, and countless other species that had nearly disappeared from the area decades earlier. The old Ford 8N still rested inside the barn. Its paint had faded even more. Its seat had been repaired twice. Every spring, Clara started it with the same careful pull on the choke. The old engine answered with its familiar rhythm, just as it always had. On quiet mornings, a light mist drifted above the spring before the sun reached the valley. Prairie grasses swayed gently in the breeze. Clear water slipped silently through the old limestone channel. And beyond the barn, the old tractor started on the first crank. If this story reminded you of a lesson passed down through your own family, or of a farm, ranch, or piece of land that someone fought to protect, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Many of the best farming stories begin with ordinary people noticing something everyone else overlooked. If you enjoyed this journey, consider subscribing for more cinematic stories inspired by American rural history, where forgotten tools, unusual discoveries, and the wisdom of nature continue to shape lives in unexpected ways. Our next story begins with something just as unlikely, and another young farmer everyone underestimated.